I had begun to speak of him. Then I stopped, because it's too painful for me. In spite of the time that has passed, in spite of everything that has happened in my life since then, bringing sometimes joy, sometimes sorrow, in spite of my latest love, so unexpected and so comforting, this boy, my husband, Theo, who no doubt will help me to die one day. Yet I have to describe what it was like when Marcel and I were together. That marvelous, that incomparable love story. The story that, when I was 30, wiped out from my past sad stories, fights and incidents with no future. How many times did my past prevent me from sleeping? Faces moving by, faces which haunted me. My father making me sing in the streets, his mistresses who would either beat me or flatter me. Louis, my first lover, Albert, the pimp from Pigalle, with whom I lived, Le Play, the owner of Gerny's, whom I'd been accused of murdering, and Raymond Dassault and Paul Maurice, all the men I dallied with, or the men who'd let me down. All that hadn't always been very pleasant. That's why I have to talk about Marcel and me today. I used to keep silent about those 2 years of my life. I couldn't even think about them, but I don't want to die without people knowing what it was really like between him and me, because no end of stories have been told about us. We were watched, spied upon, revolting things were said about us. I was accused of having stolen a husband from his wife and a father from his children. In fact, people would have given a fortune to know what really existed between him and me. Since they couldn't know, they invented it. Now I'll tell you the real story of our romance. Yes, it's true. I loved Cerdan. More than that, I worshipped him like a god. I'd have done anything, whatever, for him, to keep his memory alive, to let the whole world know how generous, how wonderful he was. I wanted to shout it from the rooftops. Marcel Cerdan changed my life. Before I met him, I was nothing at all. Oh, yes, I know. I was a famous singer, very famous even. But deep within myself, I was a woman in despair. I thought that life was meaningless, that all men were beasts. I thought the best thing to do was to go on laughing it off, drinking and doing crazy things, waiting to die as soon as possible. Raymond Dassault was the only man who tried to make me see that there was another way of life, but I'd been unfaithful to him. He hadn't been strong enough to hold me. To be honest, I hadn't been in love with him. I just asked him to help me. Marcel taught me how to live. He took away from me the bitterness and the taste of despair that was poisoning me, body and soul. He showed me that kindness, calm, and affection existed, and then my world was filled with light. I remember what plenty of well-intentioned people said to me at this time. How can you be in love with a boxer? He's a brute. A brute, that man who could have given them lessons in how to behave with sensitivity. But I have to tell you that I too didn't discover Cerdan's secret straight away. I even thought that he was mean, and that's one of the faults I would criticize most in a man. For meanness isn't just a question of money, it's a question of behavior. A man who's mean with money is also mean with love. Poor Marcel. Quite simply, he refused, when I first met him, to do something that would have been very easy for him. He refused to try and impress me. It was in 1947 in New York. We had been introduced to each other at a cocktail party. Marcel was preparing his first American campaign. I was in the midst of rehearsing for my recital. We were two French people in New York, two French people who knew nobody and felt bored. It had to happen. One evening, Marcel Cerdan telephoned me at my apartment at the Waldorf Astoria. He invited me to have dinner with him, and I accepted straight away. I felt delighted and proud of myself. I put on my makeup with great care. I wore my most beautiful dress. Marcel arrived and said simply, "Come along quickly. I'm as hungry as a hunter." I said to myself, "Well, that's good. We're going to go to a good restaurant and have a real blowout." In the street, I trotted alongside this man who was the size of a massive wardrobe. Suddenly, he pushed open a door and took me into a seedy drugstore. We sat on stools at the bar and ate pastrami, boiled salt beef. Then he offered me an ice and a beer. The whole lot cost 40 cents, not quite 200 francs. At the end of the meal, I said, rather primly, "Well, when you invite someone out, you don't exactly ruin yourself." He could have been angry. He just looked rather surprised at my reaction. Then he smiled. "That's no problem." And he took me to one of the most famous restaurants in New York, Le Gourmet. There we ate a second meal, a real one. I only discovered Marcel's secret when we met for the second time. It was in Paris a few months later. I had passed him in the street and saw he had a strange companion. He was with a friend, and I was holding his arm. An odd friend, an Arab who was almost blind. I was intrigued. I went with them for part of the way, and that was how I heard the whole story. This unfortunate man was one of Cerdan's childhood friends, and Marcel had decided he would save him from going blind. He had brought him to Paris, paying his fare from Casablanca, and then each morning he took him to the specialist. He looked after him affectionately and consoled him. He paid for all his medical care. I've never seen a man care for someone with such devotion, with such a persistent urge to save him. And he succeeded in working the miracle. When he took his friend to the airport to catch the plane to North Africa, the man was cured. He had recovered his sight. As for me, I'd been won over forever. I was fascinated by so much goodness. Cerdan, who was world champion, rich and adored, could have thought about himself a little, could have taken holidays, I don't know what else. Instead, he devoted himself to others. I learned, too, that for this reason he had taken on a tour of exhibition bouts in Provence instead of taking a rest after a particularly tough match. Did he do it to earn more money? No. He had made over his fee to a center for children suffering from TB. When I heard the news, I was indignant. I cabled him from New York. "Why did you do that? Suppose you have trouble. Who will get you out of it?" He replied to me with a long letter. "I went to those kids. I felt their little hands touching me, and I thought, it's good to feel useful. So does money really matter?" I could give endless examples of his amazing generosity. The one which touched me the most, the one I found the most moving, is this. It happened on a day when he was fighting a match with an old boxer who didn't have a chance against him. He was just about to give the knockout punch when he heard the man's voice. "Let me go on, Marcel," he begged. "Let me go on." So he allowed himself just to win on points. And when the crowd booed him, he didn't turn a hair. When he told me the story, he explained his reaction. "They booed me, but I'd never felt so happy. You see, Edith, whatever happens in life, you must always be kind to other people." Sometimes I resisted this idea. But he was patient, and he could do what he wanted with me. One evening, outside the ABC Music Hall, a crowd of fans surrounded me. They wanted to kiss me, touch me, and ask for my autograph. Oh, I was irritable and vain. I believed that all this admiration was just something I deserved. I pushed the people away and grumbled at them, "Leave me in peace," and I rushed into the car with Marcel. We drove along for a few minutes. I felt that something wasn't quite right. Suddenly he spoke to me. "Edith, tonight, for the first time, you've disappointed me." I was tired, Marcel. I was all nerves. Marcel looked at me in silence. Then all at once he said, "But the people who were waiting for your autograph were bringing you their love in exchange. Do you remember the years before you were famous, when you were waiting for these people? Just think for a moment of the day when you'll expect them and they won't come anymore." Since that night, I've never refused an autograph to anyone, however exhausted I felt. And one evening in New York, Cerdan brought me the happiest moment of my life. I'd been singing, and about midnight someone came to tell me that there was a fair on Coney Island. Marcel was with me. He took me cheerfully by the arm and said, "Come on, I'll treat you to go on the roundabout." We ran off like a couple of children. After the roundabout, he took me on to the scenic railway. He shouted with delight. I screamed with terror. Hundreds of people were standing round us in a group. They were calling out, "It's Cerdan! Hip, hip, hooray!" Marcel whispered in my ear, "They've recognized me and not you." I was feeling angry already when someone shouted, "Edith, sing us La Vie en Rose." Then they stopped all the roundabouts. There was total silence, and I sang. When the people applauded me at the end, I turned around. Marcel looked shaken. "What you do, Edith, is better than what I do. You bring them happiness and love." At these words, I felt tears running down my cheeks. I, better than Cerdan. It was the finest compliment any man could pay me, a compliment I didn't think I deserved. When I talk about Cerdan, yes, just at the mention of his name, I feel better. He was greater than other men. When he was there, unbelievable things were possible. There's one thing that so far I haven't mentioned to anyone. I didn't want the sneers of the skeptics to spoil one of my most wonderful memories of happiness. Just once, for Cerdan, I asked heaven for a miracle, and heaven granted my wish. It was a few weeks before the World Championship, in which he was going to challenge Tony Zale. "Listen," I suggested. "Tomorrow we're going to Lisieux and pray for you to win the fight." In the church, I prayed. I prayed to Saint Thérèse. "I'm asking for nothing else," I begged her. "On the contrary, leave me the suffering and the sorrow. I deserve them. But for him, because you know all about his sacrifices and all the efforts he makes. For him, because everything depends on this fight. Give him victory." A few days later, I was getting ready to go to New York, where Marcel's fight would take place. I was just finishing my packing. My friend Ginette and her husband Michel were with me. Suddenly, we looked at each other. We were all surprised. A strong scent of roses had spread through my room. It lasted only a few seconds at the most. Ginette and Michel looked everywhere. They thought a bottle of perfume had broken. It wasn't that. I knew what it was. I had spent my childhood at Lisieux, and I knew that when the saint fulfilled someone's wish, she produced a scent of roses close to them. At that moment, I knew that Marcel Cerdan would be world champion. And yet, a week later, during the match, I didn't dare look at the ring. In the famous fourth round, Tony Zale nearly got Marcel down. I thought I would die. In the hall, in the midst of the shouting crowd, I prayed to the saint. I said to her, "You promised he would win. Don't forget him." I prayed and I drummed with my fists on the hat of a spectator who was sitting in front of me. When the fight was over, when Marcel had delivered the KO, had acknowledged the applause from the crowd, the man in the front turned round. He held out to me his battered hat. "Have it. It's no use to me in this state, but for you, it'll be a souvenir of a very happy occasion." Outside the ring, Cerdan was the most gentle of men. I only saw him fight another man twice, both times on my behalf. He struck one man. He gave the other a beating. The former had told stories about me that were worse than unpleasant. Marcel met him at the Salle Wagram one evening when he himself was a spectator. He went up to the man, who was looking very downcast. He walked up to him with a cheerful smile. He said to him in a kind-hearted voice, "You're a bastard." Then he dealt him a fearful blow. Immediately after that, he begged his friends, "Take him away quickly. Tell him to go away." For the strong man didn't enjoy fighting. He was afraid of hurting his opponent. The second man he wanted to knock down was a friend we had in common, a publicity man. He had written a newspaper article about Marcel and me, full of unpleasant lies. He knew what he had done, and that day he had come to see me, hoping that if he explained what he had done, I would forgive him. He had almost succeeded, for I always forgive people. At that precise moment, Marcel arrived. When he caught sight of the man who had betrayed our friendship, Marcel went white with rage. He got hold of the man's jacket by the revers. He drove him across my drawing room, hitting him as hard as he could. The other man was moaning, "Forgive me, Marcel. Don't hit me any more, Marcel." But Cerdan was furious. He dragged the man over to me. He gave me an order, "Spit in his face." I tried to obey Cerdan, but I was terribly upset. I couldn't do it. Then Marcel pushed him towards the door. "Get the hell out of here, and don't let me see you here ever again." Marcel didn't understand how anyone could be dishonest. He always left his money, his papers, or his suitcases lying about, just anywhere, and the strangest thing was that nobody ever stole from him. He could not believe in human wickedness. It was Marcel who taught me everything that matters in life, everything that can let you look in the mirror without being ashamed, without blushing at the thought of your past. And what did I give him in return? Not very much. When I first knew him, I used to laugh at him, for when he was on his own, in planes or trains, he read nothing except comics, cowboy stories, strip cartoons, and detective novels. "Now look, Marcel," I would say to him, "you ought to read something else." Patiently, I put into the world champion's hands books by Gide, Steinbeck, and Jack London. I watched carefully to see that he wasn't hiding cartoons inside the books. At first he would look at me with a hangdog expression and complain, "Why are you doing this to me, Edith? Why are you forcing me to read when it's fine outside and I was thinking of going for a walk?" But I was soon sorry that I'd had this idea, for he became a real fanatic. He began to think of nothing else except books. He would walk along the quays and do the rounds of the bouquinistes. When he was reading, he thought of nothing else. When I came in, he barely noticed. I also taught him how to dress. Before that, he would just put on what he happened to find close at hand. He adored purple ties and spotted shirts. I soon put a stop to that. Even when I sang, Marcel did not leave me. From the stage, I could see him standing in the wings. He listened to me. He looked after the curtains. If anyone made a sound, he would be angry. He would look at me with astonishment and say to anyone who cared to listen, "Just imagine, that little slip of a woman, how does she manage to sing like that?" This love was too wonderful for me. Horror entered my life once more. The appalling event overwhelmed me. The Paris-New York plane crash in the Azores. Marcel Cerdan was on board. Marcel Cerdan was dead. That night I was singing in New York, on stage at the Versailles, one of the smartest nightclubs in New York City. There are no words strong enough to describe the martyrdom I was suffering. I was desperately wounded in body and soul, but I got through to the end. Before my first song, I'd made an announcement. This evening I shall sing in memory of Marcel Cerdan. I shall sing only for him. Perhaps this was the reason I didn't kill myself. Not that what I did next was much better. All the same, our life doesn't belong to us. You need courage to get to the very end. In any case, since then, Marcel has never left me. Even today, when I have to take a decision, I always ask myself, what would Marcel do in my place? It's too bad for the incredulous. They'll smile, but since Marcel's death, I've believed in spiritualism. I believe in the warnings that come from table turning. Have I any proof? Well, after that ghastly evening at every spiritualist's seance, the table always gave me one date. Always the same date. February 17th. February 17th. At each seance I would ask, "Is it good news?" And the table replied, "Yes." Finally, February 17th, 1950 arrived. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon there was a ring at my door. A young telegraph boy handed me a telegram. This is what it said. "Edith, come to Casablanca. I want to see you." It was signed Marinette. Marinette Cerdan, Marcel Cerdan's wife. I took the first plane for Casablanca. She was there at the airport waiting for me. We fell into each other's arms. We were both in tears. "Marinette," I said to her, "if I can help you, if I can replace Marcel in any small way, if you need me, I'm there. I'll always be there." I'd found a reason for living again. I was saved. Soon I was going to busy myself with Cerdan's son. If people don't understand this, it's because they've never loved anyone and never lost their love because death passed that way. They limit themselves to the petty occupations of the living. Marinette and I had been changed by one man.